Good evening, and I say good evening because that's the time I'm recording this. In case I cannot get to do it live, good afternoon. It will be on the day of the presentation. So thank you so much for being part of the ASOCOPI annual conference. Thank you for joining me this afternoon in this plenary that I have titled Landscaping English Literacies in Colombia, or Why English Isn't Foreign to Us Anymore. Look forward to sharing my insights with you and the conversation that will ensue during the presentation and after that. Before we would start, I think it's fitting to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting today from Medellin, Antioquia, a land that historically has been under the protection, the care, and the auspice of the Embera, the Senu, and the Kunatule. I take a moment to acknowledge their presence, to acknowledge their culture, to acknowledge their languages as part of all this work that we are doing here and the conversations we're having this weekend to transform our community of English language education in Colombia. I also take a moment to acknowledge, as it has been throughout the year, a moment to celebrate Paulo Freire and his influence in our field and his influence in our work, and his influence in my work, and his very idea that language is never neutral, that has been one of the, let's say, one of the compasses that has guided my research over the years. So this presentation has to do a lot with evolution. Personal evolution, research evolution. There is an Easter egg for my students in the subtitle. They will definitely understand, and the thing I say when I'm not Pikachu, that one is with a lot of love to all my students at UPB over the years. So it's been almost 10 years, and this presentation it's framed around that almost a decade I've been at the university, and almost a decade of my research lab. So I said how it started, how it's going. You have seen a lot of changes in the glasses, a lot of changes in the hair, a lot of changes in a lot of things. And those changes have also influenced the work that we do at the Literacies in Second Languages project, the project that started in 2012. And as I said, next year we celebrate our 10th year anniversary, but we're kicking off the celebration this year in ASOCOPI. And it's also looking at the evolution of the field. And I remember a lot of the complaints we had that all the students wanted to write in their thesis was how to improve reading comprehension. And these instrumental views and these narrow views of teaching and didactics, and ingraining this idea of language neutrality, and always importing frameworks. And we have grown. We see more criticality. We see more discussions about social justice in the classroom, social justice in the curriculum, policies, etc. We see the work on literacies as a grassroots transformation, and we see more and more efforts to create our homegrown, our original frameworks. And I will return to this idea throughout the presentation. But with that evolution, I'm still worried that we still feel entrenched to using some frameworks in English. And I always ask myself questions that we try to decolonize these frameworks, but I ask myself a question: can we really decolonize EFL, for example? Kind of like, can we make a square round? I mean, there are some things that you cannot decolonize no matter how hard you try. There are some things you cannot change no matter how hard you try. And we don't want to move beyond these frameworks, and we sometimes try to look the other way related to the complicated histories. Some of these frameworks that we still use and some people hold near and dear, they have complicated histories. Histories of oppression, histories of colonization, and histories of gentrification through language. And we cannot ignore those histories if we really want to get into a serious sense of evolution. So I shared two thoughts about why we need to think this deeply. And the first, I found this lovely graffiti with that famous quote by Audre Lorde: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And the second thought I share is a thought from my mentor, Arlette Willis. And she says, I heard her say this in a webinar a few weeks ago, when it says the people who brought us to this place cannot be the people who move us from this place. And I add, this does not apply to just people, it applies to frameworks and acronyms too. So this presentation has a lot to do with how we move forward collectively. I want to share the collective journey of one person, just a dude, as I like to say, in community with a research lab, and how together we keep growing and we keep evolving. I will develop that with 3 points. First, the idea of decentering, decentralizing the conversation. Second, I will frame these lessons within the research body that we have created. And then I will talk about English in Colombia, and I have this quote, the force is the key to all of this. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that in the presentation, why I'm making a reference to Star Wars. There are myriad of reasons, I'll get to them. So first, let's talk about this idea of decentering and decentralizing the conversation. What do I mean by that? So I'm sharing a quote from a recent article from Research in the Teaching of English from last year. And we say that decentering, decentralizing refers to moving the conversation away from traditional groups and geographical locations. And it's an invitation to start looking at how we are dealing with people in the periphery and how we are creating spaces in places that sometimes are sites of marginalization. So I repeat, moving away from the traditional groups and the geographical places that dictate, for example, what constitutes English, or how English should be taught, or how we should research the English in anywhere. When we think about what decentering, decentralizing mean, first of all, it means accepting that some frameworks we use are obsolete. It's coming to terms with that. It's not an easy thing. It's taken me a while. It's taken me almost my entire career to really come to terms with that. It's also asking questions about who gets to be, or gets to have access and purpose within those frameworks. Who gets to own the language? Who gets to play with the language? Who gets to say it's my language? And also rethinking the goals for language learning and teaching in these communities, while we also bring input from the non-traditional stakeholders. How often do we really ask the input from school teachers? And I mean beyond asking them to review the standards. How often do we really look at what students are doing and getting input from what students are doing? How often do we talk to the families? How often do we talk to people who are not the usual owners of the conversation? This also means acknowledging that we have local varieties of English in our cities and in our neighborhoods, and that we have to open room for them in the curriculum and in our research, in our conversations, transcending just the view of standard. And it's welcoming those Englishes in our different spaces, academic or schooling, communities and neighborhoods. How often do publications open room for local varieties of English in the, to appear in the manuscripts? How often do they force us to go either US or UK, leaving everybody else out? How do we combat that binary domination? That is what's at the core of decentering and decentralizing. It's also thinking about the questions or the reasons we learn English. Are we still living by investment models where, oh, you think about English as something you can use later, something for the job, something for the travel? What about the now and the here? And how about thinking of languages in a more ecological way, where languages are not necessarily predating the other languages in the land, and how we rethink those relationships, how we counter the different forms of othering that we have in relation to the other languages and the other varieties of English, for example, and think about that we have foreign languages that are here, that the notion of saying English as a foreign language defies the notion that there are local languages that are foreign to us, that they have native status, that in our collective imaginaries, they are foreign languages. Although people who share our ancestry and people who share our nationality speak them and use them? How do we counter that foreignness of the local languages? It also means how we recenter our voices in terms of curriculum and policies, and how we develop this sense of language ownership. Languages cannot be foreign if they belong to me. That's one of the central points I always like to bring. And as we think about the roles we want to envision for English as we move forward, as something that it's on their own in relation to the other languages and in relation to the different language users. So thinking about the notion of linguistic justice and how linguistic justice should inform our framing of English as we continue moving forward. This introduction of decentering, decentralizing brings us now into the second part of this presentation, which is the lessons I have learned from nearly a decade of research. But when I say I have learned, I want to be very clear that this is not an I that is completely isolated from the others. It's a very orthographic I in a sense. And I want to use an example from comics. And I want to use the idea of Venom. Venom as a symbiote. That, you know, if you know the comics, the Eddie Brock and Venom they work together and they coexist in a symbiosis. And that's how I see this. That's how I see my research. That's how I see my Legion, and how I see the Legion, and how I see myself. I see the three of those three elements as symbiotic. I cannot talk about my research if I don't talk about the presence of my students and my mentees at the Literacies and Second Languages Project. And I cannot think about myself detached from my relationship with them, with the mentorship and the friendship and the fellowship that we have developed as a community over the almost 10 years. So with that in mind, the research that frames this presentation comes from three particular projects. One that has been exploring since 2013 literacies in the city of Medellin, and how second language literacies are helping us rethink the local landscape. So this idea of revisiting space. The second research project that started in 2014 that has to do with the digital culture of video games and how through that we rethink language. And then the third project that's ongoing since 2015, where we're looking at language learning in our schools in this thing we call reinventing education. The first project, the city's literacy project, is something that I'm calling a retcon longitudinal study. It didn't really start as a longitudinal study, but it's been shaping up, and we have been retconning the design to make it longitudinal. Already in finishing the third phase, starting the fourth phase, where we think about the city as a language laboratory. So we're also thinking of the pedagogical approach to making the city a learning site. The second study, the languages victory, which is the video games, looking at the language strategies within gaming experiences, but also thinking of the countercultural look of gamification. Shameless plug, there is one presentation today from our team that will talk about that countercultural look. And then the idea of the 21st century literacy, the P20 spectrum, where we think about implementing literacy theory in local classrooms with a particular emphasis on public schools and teacher education programs. This, the research body that comes and supports my assertions. And again, I always like to go back to, and I say when I wrote the proposal, that this is kind of a sequel to my last plenary in ASOCOPI in 2012, when I kind of started laying out some ideas about how to break that EFL, ESL binary. And I said, that was a lot of an intuition. Now I'm bringing more of an assertion that is backed by research. And the research body that you see includes 24 publications, 24 theses for undergraduate and master's program, and over 140 presentations, including a lot of presentations at ASOCOPI, a place that has been our home permanently since 2015. So let's take a quick look now at the main question. What have we learned about English in Colombia after all this field work? So the first thing that we have learned to understand English in Colombia is by looking at traditional assessments and measures of English, a lot of stories In fact, too many stories are falling through the cracks. We are losing track of a lot of histories and a lot of stories about how people access and purpose language and give purpose to language. We have data about the use of graffiti and the language exchange communities that are happening, and how people use fashion and how people use tattoos as ways to provide new forms of access and purpose, and how that enriches the local Englishes that we have, and the different levels of language ownership. When we think about the traditional assessments and measures, what happens is we give this uniform view, this uniform outlook of the language landscape, when the reality is there are varying degrees of language ownership, each of them as valid as the next. As we have communities where there are clusters in the cities where people are certainly with languages circulating freely in terms of goods and services, and in terms of conversations, and in terms of mobility, there are places where the language has specific purpose. And there are places where all you see is the names of the stores. That flow, that's how language operates in the city. That's how language operates in real life. So it's important, as we look at this divide of the traditional assessments and measures, think about the goals and the reasons that we have for learning the language, and the reasons and the goals that we are selling and we are offering and we're promoting to learn the language. And think about, in those stories, how many of the non-traditional stakeholders are being overlooked. How often we ignore the stories of people who own the shops and they name the shops in English or in another language, but let's say just English for the sake of this conversation. How often do we overlook the narratives behind the choices? How often do we ignore the narratives behind people's choices to get tattoos made in other languages, and we just dismiss them as a fad, or we just decide that we're going to focus more on the spelling, on the potential spelling mistakes that happen in the tattoo, but we don't think about what propelled that person to go into that route. I argue that an organic view of language and literacy practices, where we really move beyond the traditional assessments, is going to show us a lot more nuance and a lot more interplay. It's going to show us more flow. It's going to show us more possibilities to play with the language. It's going to show us what people really do with the language, both in the class, but especially outside of the class. That gives me to the second point. If you start looking for like second language literacies, you're going to find them everywhere. And we have found that creativity is all over the place. We just need to stop long enough to take a look. And then when you stop, because that's the thing, sometimes we dismiss it. Sometimes I ask the students, how often do you see the ads or the names of the stores or the graffiti? And how often do you dismiss it? You see it, but you dismiss it. You see it, but you overlook it. You see it, but you ignore it. What if you stop ignoring those practices? You start realizing that there are a lot of non-traditional stakeholders playing with language, creating social commentary, creating spaces for conversation, that there are language communities happening where I'm talking we as the higher education people, we are not leading the charge. We are not leading the communities. Some people are just congregating because they want to, and they are owning that language, and that's giving more growth to these possibilities of local Englishes. So it's important in that sense to think about our cities and our digital communities are catalysts for those literacies in the different languages. Our call, our duty is not to ignore them or not to marginalize them. It's to really give them the proper value in the proper context. That brings me into this idea of real-time purpose and real-time context. As I said in the first presentation, sometimes we really go by these investment models of, oh, we're learning English for the job and for later, for vacation, for when we're grown-ups, when we're adults, and then time passes by, we never get to use it. What happens when I can still project, think the future, but I think more about right now, and I think about today, if you refocalize your goals and your purposes, what you're going to find is a lot of stuff is happening with those languages, and a lot of stuff is taking place through those languages right here, right now, in this very moment. And that also goes into that sense of language ownership, that we are decentering, decentralizing this conversation by people owning the language to talk about stuff right now. We have evidence in the research of students creating podcasts to talk about their daily lives, and students using multimodality to talk about environmental issues. For me, that's important. Sure, their command of the language is still primitive based on the traditional measures, but shouldn't it count that they're using it to talk about real life issues, that they're talking about, they're using it for social and for social consciousness, that they're using it for social awareness, for activism? Shouldn't that count for anything? Shouldn't that be the point of teaching and learning and teaching the language? That means we have to think about the goals that we're setting for this. And in that sense, I believe that we start revising this view of English can help us place the language at the service of people and the service of communities. The language should serve the people, not the other way around. Traditional understandings keep putting people below and beneath the languages. We shouldn't serve the languages. The languages should serve us. We should be the ones who decide what language is for and what languages we bring to the table and what for. We, the people, not the language, not the standards, not the top-down mandates. And in that sense, I'm also thinking about the transformative nature of English literacies. And as we think about a realistic use of the language, what we find is our classrooms can become real sites for transformation, where we can recenter our students and our teachers' voices. I mean, I am not forgetting about the teachers. Sometimes in a lot of conversations, we think a lot about the students. We never think enough about the teachers. We need to also recenter the teachers in this conversation as part of this community. We also have to acknowledge the local Englishes that our teachers and our students bring to the class, and how that help us revisit the goals and interrogate the reasons we teach and learn the language. It's again, how we get the non-traditional stakeholders involved in the conversation, and how we ask questions about access, and how we ask questions about purpose. This is going to bring us then to the third and final point of this plenary. And as I said, I'm going super geeky on this one. I'm going super freaky on this one, to make a reference to the force. And I say the force is the key to all of this. I won't get into the details how I got to this epiphany, but anybody who wants to ask me later, I'm happy to tell you how it happened. So the first question is, why the force? So I decided to share a quote from the Jedi Path. And I think of Jedi, and I think of teachers, and I see the similarities. When I say we Jedi are blessed with the gift of swimming in the force at every moment, think about teachers and the relation with language. When you're breathing it, you're tasting it, you're writing it. When I say for the Jedi, universe is never cold and directionless, the force gives us purpose and compels us to share a gift with others. Teachers, our teaching and our teaching English gives us purpose. And we want to share that gift, the gift of language. So am I going out of my way to say that teachers are basically kind of like Jedi? Yes, I am. That's one of the takeaways of this lesson. We are Jedi Knights and Jedi Masters in our own right. That's one of the takeaways of this plenary. But let's get more into how I connect the force and how I connect the force with English language education. So I think about, when I think about the force in relation, in languages, is kind of the idea of the force, I'm always thinking of this organic view. And in this organic view, it's also reflecting on the models that we're going to promote moving forward, and how those models are not going to ignore the history. If we want to create more organic models and more equitable models, we need to contend with the history of the languages we teach. That there are a lot of dark stories around those languages. That doesn't mean we shouldn't teach it. No, it means we can do better than our predecessors may have done. And we can do better than the history that permeates the languages. But it's understanding that history, it's recognizing that we have to break power dynamics and symbolic violence that we have faced as language users and as language learners and as language teachers. That we've all dealt with some different levels of microaggressions in our careers, whether we have been on the giving end or the receiving end, we've all been there. And understanding that when it comes to the goals for the language, there are goals that can be macro, meso, and we can have micro goals. Each of us can have goals for that language. And we need to have that diversity. We cannot simply expect to have macro goals that are going to cover all of us. Your goals, those of you listening to this presentation for English, are very different from the goals I have. But even in that difference, we can have points of convergence. But the fact that we have different goals and we can bring them together to really think collectively about what this language is supposed to mean for us as we finish this decade and we project ourselves to the next decade of this century, it's going to be necessary. That also invites me to think about these organic learning and teaching models. I'm thinking about organic models within this sense of language ecology. I'm a fierce advocate of the idea of language ecology and thinking of language ecosystems in the sense of that we want to create real coexistence over interference, and thinking of language preservation, that if we're going to teach these languages, we have to teach these languages not losing track of the other language in the land, and how we, from this position, how we, from our vantage point of English teachers, we're also going to strive for the preservation of the local languages of the land. And in these organic models, all the stakeholders I mentioned earlier are going to come together. Teachers, students, communities, and others I may have not mentioned this plenary that are still there, have to come together to set the rules. And thinking an organic rule in this organic model, multilingualism is not a zero-sum game. Bilingualism is not a zero-sum game. All the languages in the land have to fit in this model, have to belong to this model, have to belong in this model, have to be at the table. All of them. If one of them is absent, then this model is not organic, it's not fulfilling the purpose that we should have for this. And in that sense, I always going back to the idea of the force has always been around us. The force is here, the languages have been here. And we have to think about that there are examples already in place. Think about the great plenaries, the one before this one, and the ones that are coming later, the examples that they're going to provide. And look at the sessions, look at the program, and you're going to see that this is already happening. This transformation is already going on, it's already in progress, but we need to do a better job connecting the dots. We need to do a better job of bringing them together and coming together. So that brings me to this idea that I've been advocating for the past few years of Colombian English, of English in Colombia as Colombian English. Understanding Colombian English as something that's going to go beyond the jokes and beyond the memes, but we're not dismissing them. I think the jokes that we have, and you have seen all the websites and all the comment on the jokes, that's also part of this interplay, this construction of language. We shouldn't dismiss them as mistakes, and we shouldn't dismiss them as wrong. We have to make them part of this conversation. But most importantly, the second point, I am not thinking of Colombian English as a repackaging of EFL. This is not EFL repackaged. This is not old wine in new bottles. I'm not repackaging. I'm not reloading EFL. No, I'm moving past. I'm inviting you to move past EFL, as bold and brazen a proposition as that is. I never said it wasn't bold. I never said it wasn't brazen. I never said it wasn't daring. Some people may even think it's preposterous. Some people may even think it's ridiculous. And some people may even think it's ludicrous. But the only way we can rewrite the field and we can decentralize the language, the teaching, and all of us is if we move beyond. and we do not try to repackage, because the problem and the thing is, and we have to really be vigilant, because EFL will try to find a way to repackage itself within this framework. So I'm invited for a rewriting, for a shift, for a paradigm shift, for a methodological shift. I'm not asking to do more of the same with a different name. We already tried that and we have failed. Let's try something different this time around. That's what I'm inviting you for. And I'm inviting you with that to keep it in mind two dimensions of this conversation, the historical and the political. When I talk about the historical, it's recognizing that English has been in this country, and in this land, and in this region for decades, for centuries. That the idea of bringing English in Colombia didn't start, it didn't start in the 1990s with the Coffee Project. It has been long before that. It's been forever, and acknowledging that means we're going to acknowledge the communities that have been playing and morphing and transforming that language. A language that is in constant evolution, that is in constant flux, that has been in constant flux for 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 years. Without the acknowledgement of the historical, we are going to keep thinking that English is a foreign language. No, it stopped being a foreign language a long time ago. Ask some of the communities that have been trading in that language. And by trading, I mean playing and doing the craft and crafting it for centuries. And they'll tell you that that language is not foreign to them. Think about the different communities we have in our neighborhoods where English is already helping them transform their communities. They'll tell you English is not foreign to them. Just because the standards say it's foreign doesn't mean it is. Which brings us into the political. It's putting English in a place where it's one of many. It's one of several. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just one more. And again, as I said in the previous slide, how we put English at the service of the local languages. How we put English to the service of the indigenous languages, and how we put English to the service of the sign languages, and how we put English to the service of the local varieties of English that are happening in our communities. How we put it to work for us for a change, as opposed to us working for it/them. And that also means, and I'm sharing with you 4 points. As I said, this is what I think it means, and it's the beginning, for me, it's the beginning of a manifesto. When I'm thinking about colonial English, I'm talking about envisioning ourselves as conceptual frameworks, as we ourselves as a conceptual framework that is giving birth to this notion, but it's also how we build theory around it. Homegrown, local theory, where we reject the binary views of language and the binary views of conceptualization, and how we reduce the abyssal views of language, as Ophelia Garcia and colleagues have been inviting us, that are rooted in native speakerism. How we reject those views, and we really start fighting for linguistic justice in our communities. Linguistic justice, that means reclaiming our accents, reclaiming our registers, reclaiming our genres that are happening through this language we call English. But also means transcending quick fixes, one-size-fits-all solutions, and really developing grassroots and participatory research in our field, or continuing, because it's already happening, thinking about further and further the potential of this kinds of research as a starting point. In a country, in a community where we have so many publications and so many scholars, both in higher ed and in secondary and in elementary, when we have students thinking wonderful ideas, and I'm kind of thinking of the nominees to the best undergraduate thesis, and I'm thinking of all the students I have had a chance to listen to universities like Bolivariana or Luis Amigo or others. And I see the potential, I see the grassroots is already happening. And that means we have to think about Colombian English as something we're going to build collectively, communally, in Colombia, from Colombia, as part of the global South, where we're not going to just simply go into that rejection of the global north, but get into real community and thinking of opening more spaces for dialogue, for voices that are not at the table today, voices that are absent for one reason or another at this very conference. So I kind of like to end the session with that. For this quote from Star Wars movie Rogue One, and I think I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me, because that's how I see the languages I speak. I am one with my languages, and the languages are with me. Those languages that we use and we are one with are not foreign to any of us. So let's stop thinking in that sense of languages as in the foreignness. Once I own them, they are mine. How do we create models of Colombian English that acknowledge that ownership that is happening in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our communities, in our digital spaces, in the culture, in the communities, the fandom, video games, etc. I just want to close with one question: is this change really possible? I know that there are things in this proposal that people may say they're naive, impractical, untenable, and we are experiencing difficult times and dark times around the world, in dark times where a lot of questions and demands are being placed on education, sometimes unfairly and unjustly. I'm aware of that. But also as someone who has informed his work, and I'm going back to Paulo Freire and going back to critical theory, this is one thing I always tell students when I teach critical theory: one does not do critical theory out of despair. One does critical theory out of hope. Hope and love are at the core of any critical stance in education. Understanding that the times will be dark, but we have to be that light. I kind of like that quote from Sting in English in New York: "At night, a candle's brighter than the sun." Let's be that candle. Let's think about the possibility of change. Whether you accept or reject this framework, just having the conversation is a start. But to ask myself the question, is change really possible? Is this change really possible? I'm going to end this particular question with a little reference to a show that I really, really love, Ted Lasso. And kind of like what Ted would tell us: friends, folks, we have to believe. We have to live in the possibility of the impossible. We have to believe in the possibility of something better. That's my wager as a scholar, as an activist, as a mentor. I believe in the potential of this framework. I believe in the potential of better ways to think about English in Colombia. That has been my fight for this decade. That will continue to be my fight for as long as I'm an active member of this English education community in this country, wherever I am in the near or far future. I'll always be an ally. I'll always be a co-conspirator. I'll always be striving for a better world, and I'll always be striving for a better place. As within a community. I'm not just myself, I'm part of a community. That community is part of me. And with that parting thought, I want to express my gratitude to everybody for listening to this presentation. In case you want to continue the conversation even further, there is my email, there is my Twitter account. For more information, if you want to check more of the stuff that we do at the Literacies Second Language Project, there is also the website and our Twitter and Instagram account. So once again, for your openness to listen to me talk about these ideas for these few minutes in this plenary, my gratitude and appreciation. Thank you very much. And now I look forward to the ensuing conversation about this plenary during this little bit after this, and everybody continue enjoying the ASOCOPI conference. Thank you very much.